us. All right, thanks so much. So as I mentioned, EcoSpark is a charity, and we're based in Toronto, work throughout the Greater Toronto area, and now even broader. We've had webinars across North America, which is kind of insane. But wherever we are talking with people, we're encouraging them to take an active role in protecting and sustaining their local environment. So we give people the tools for education, monitoring, and influencing positive change. And I'll say that in my time at EcoSpark, I've proceeded through Discover, Act, Change over and over again with every new outing that we've got, more environments to explore with people from different perspectives. And I just keep loving that transition from discovering maybe a new bird species, acting to protect its habitat, and then encouraging others to make that change throughout the community so we can support quite a range of biodiversity right in our neighborhoods where we live. Just a little delay on the slides here. There we go. So joining us today is Sarah Karuvula from our Greenbelt program. So starting here on the bottom left of your screen, she'll fill us in a bit more about the Greenbelt and how this amazing area surrounding Toronto is supporting biodiversity, and then how in turn you can be supporting the Greenbelt. EcoSpark runs a number of different programs, so just very briefly, you may have been in our training session for changing currents in past years, or familiar with the school groups that go out, actually put on waders, get in the streams, look at some of the critters that live there, and then evaluate those pieces of information that they're gathering to look at the stream health. So which species are living in the stream, the biodiversity metrics from that show us an indicator of the stream health. And we've got a tool to share with you about how you can see all of those results online and see the stream that's nearest where you live and how it's doing based on the data from these students going out and community volunteers collecting information. The other three projects here, if you're keeping track, School Watch, Park Watch, and Nature Academy, are all citizen science programs that have resources available for training on very simple sort of homegrown science techniques to help you look at ecology and biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem closest to where you are, whether that's a school ground, your local park, or we do teacher trainings as well. So also joining us today, I'll just make one more introduction. Emily Heidendahl from the City of Toronto, I'm sure you're familiar with. She is available to talk a little bit about the Community Stewardship Program, and we'll have a moment for questions related directly to that hands-on volunteer work that goes on with the city. It's an amazing program, and we've been lucky enough at EcoSpark to join up with CSP for some Phragmites restoration work over the past few years and learned a lot from them. So thanks, Emily. Emily's also helping me monitor chat today. Just a brief summary of all of these programs, where they're taking place: schools, parks, communities, and especially during COVID, right in our own backyards. We're even doing window bird surveys from indoors. So if you've got a window from your computer screen right now, you can glance out, and we'll just do a mini survey during the webinar. If you see any wildlife, I would love for you to enter it into the chat. And sometimes I have a spider come by when I'm doing Zoom calls, so I like to note when they're making an appearance. Anything that you see that moves outdoors, that's a citizen science observation of nearby nature. So we're gonna do a little mini experiment here. If you see anything today, you can add it to the chat. All right, without further ado, I'm gonna introduce Sarah, and she'll let us know about Greenbelt.
Thanks, Dana. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone today. As Dana mentioned, my name is Sarah Karuvula. I'm the Citizen Science Assistant at EcoSpark. And I am in charge of the Greenbelt Youth Ambassador Program that you can see right here. It's a program that engages mainly with high school students and university students. to become effective advocates in the protection of the Greenbelt, Southern Ontario's Greenbelt. In addition to just generally learning about the Greenbelt and its importance, the youth ambassadors also work together as a cohort in coming together to plan on the best ways to educate and create awareness to the public and their peers, and in the process just become better environmental leaders themselves for the future. I can go next slide, Dina.
It's coming. There's a delay. All right. Little problem with the share. It's clicked onto it. So just let me back out of here. And bear with us. Okay, we should be good to go. Southern Ontario's Greenbelt.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. So just a bit of background for those of you who may or may not know about the Greenbelt. It's a highly protected area since 2005 that roughly wraps around the Greater Toronto area, and it's known to play an extremely important role within the province. It's known to safeguard natural resources that clean our air and water. It's known to mitigate the impacts of climate change. It consists of the most fertile soil in the country, and believe it or not, it actually contributes to Ontario's economy as well. If you'd like to learn a bit more about what a Greenbelt is in general and the specifics of Southern Ontario's Greenbelt, I would highly recommend you check out ecospark's interactive story map. There will be a link to that in the chat that'll be put later on. So definitely recommend checking that one out. Next slide, Dina. So another major aspect of the Greenbelt is its significance as one of the most biologically diverse areas in Canada. According to a report by Ontario Nature and a joint report by Ontario Nature and the David Suzuki Foundation, they stated that the Greenbelt is home to about 78 out of the 200 species at risk found in Ontario. A good example of this is the beloved monarch butterfly. I'm sure that many of you might like, as I do. But even though the Greenbelt has this great significance to it, it still continues to experience the pressures of urban development every day. And in the process, natural areas are slowly getting paved over or split apart into smaller fragments that just cannot sustain diverse plant or animal communities. And this is particularly concerning when you consider the different stats on biodiversity being lost in Ontario overall. The loss of biodiversity in Ontario, as you can see in this image created by the Sierra Club of Canada. Next slide. So because of these different concerns, the youth ambassadors are actually actively tackling issues that might have the greatest impact on the Greenbelt. And they're doing this even during COVID in remote locations. So a good example of an action that they've tackled so far is this past July, they were able to submit an official response to the Ontario government. I'm not voicing their concerns about proposed amendments. I'm not too sure if some of you may or may not know, but the Ontario government recently proposed amendments to the growth plan of the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. So the youth wanted to just voice their concerns to say, we are youth, we're going to be living in this area, we're concerned about the decisions being made by adults of today. And in addition to simply just writing a response, we also had our ambassadors create a communication strategy on the best way on just spreading awareness about these amendments through social media. And we also had a team that tackled recruiting other youth organizations to get them to join onto our response that was put together. So yeah, that's just a quick summary of what the Greenbelt Youth Ambassadors have been up to. At the moment, if you go to EcoSpark's page, you can see a mention of bus tours and retreats. That is usually what we were doing pre-COVID, but now with COVID going on, we're focused more online platforms and more online advocacy. So our program is always open, and we always encourage students to register whenever they want to. Back
Thanks
to
so
you,
much,
Dana.
Sarah. That's awesome. We're gonna just take a brief pause. If anybody has a quick question for Sarah, she will need to step away, unfortunately. We've got some transportation issues that we need to take care of. So thanks so much, Sarah. If anybody would like to type into the chat a question specifically for Sarah about Greenbelt, take your moment. Otherwise, we have contact information. You can get in touch afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing program, and again, youth is a broader definition here, so university students are welcome to get involved. I know CSP has had some great showings to have university students in the past. All right. So we're going to look at a few techniques that you can try on any of these scales, including the Greenbelt, the City of Toronto, your own sidewalk. Like, we're gonna really zoom in here, just like the caterpillar. What we've been talking about is citizen science. So if you're not familiar with the term already, I just want to give a little background. Thanks, Sarah. Citizen in this case means citizen of the world. It's a very inclusive practice that is also very old. Charles Darwin, you could argue, was a citizen scientist doing like multi-year studies of earthworms in his backyard. It's really about asking questions close to home. So studying nearby nature, studying it together. It's democratic. Anybody can participate. And one of my favorite things as a citizen science researcher over the years has been to see that anybody can come up with the questions, right? It's open data. You can create a project if you're interested in getting more information from neighbors about a topic of interest. There's a lot of wonderful platforms to help you set up your own scientific protocols and questions, and really help everyone learn from each other. And also, I think it's something really important that we can do even from home to stay connected and to continue the good work of helping our local ecosystems thrive. So the data that we're gathering nearest human habitation is some of the most important for understanding the changes that the entire world is facing. So it's very meaningful, even if you don't have a lot of experience, to take some of those nature observations, even out of your own windows. So we're going to do a little mini exercise in nature observation right now. If you all humor me, I'd like you to take about 20 seconds and just scan around your immediate space, your desk, your bed, wherever you are, and see if there's something that is natural. So it might be a pencil made from wood, a feather that you've kept, a postcard from your sister of some natural place, and add it to the chat, just a little description, like I've got a pet rock, whatever. Add it to the chat if you see anything natural in your own environment. And if you can't find anything, then you can think about a place that you like to go that's very nearby. So we're looking for our neighborhood nature spots. And it doesn't have to be glorious, but a phrase that describes your nearby nature spot will give us a sense for what you've experienced with nature. For example, shady trees in my park give a break from the heat in the summer, and maybe a break from the rain if you're caught out in a little shower like I was yesterday. All right, and it looks like we're getting some chat participant. Thanks so much. Houseplants. Snake plants, I've never heard of that one. All right, and a peace lily. So I've got some Googling to do afterwards. Thank you. If anybody else has something that they see nearby that's growing or alive, We're just going to think about how nature can come to us. A big orange cat. Love it. All right, and I love that your house cat is indoors. That's always good for our bird populations to help kitties stay home. And there's really good suggestions on, I see lots of cat leashes now. My neighbors have one of those so the cat can get a break outdoors as well. Protects the native species. An ivy plant inside, Manitoba maple. I love Manitoba maples. It's not the grandest tree in some ways, right? People call them kind of a weed tree, but I think they're beautiful. And I love it's just such an urban resilience that they kind of grow up fast wherever. And I think even the species that we're not necessarily aiming for, there's a lot that we can learn from them. Shade tree, awesome. Thank you so much for participating. Ravens, yes, and butterflies, amazing. We have some monarchs in our front yard. Sometimes my kids call it the bug zoo because we've got some milkweed out there, and it's really fun to see in the fall what our migrants are doing before they're heading across the lake. So this is an exercise that you can do. You can even a group that's not really nature focused, most people have some personal connection with nature that's very powerful and important to them. And all of these observations that we're making right now together would fall into the category of citizen science, especially if you take it one step further and ask a question. So for example, if you have that object, or maybe it's that houseplant that you see, I'd like you to take just a few seconds and formulate a question in your mind about what that is. So it might be something you don't know about it, something that you wonder, or if you think a little bit, maybe if you have a feather, like I've got a crow feather, I look at the form of that, and my question is, how does the bird use this feather? Is it a flight feather? Is it like to keep it warm? What is the purpose of that feather from the bird's perspective? So that would be my question that takes the inquiry just a step further. If anybody wants to share their question, you're welcome to type it in the chat, or I'll just be quiet for a few seconds and you can think of a question. All right, amazing. So thank you for pausing there and contemplating what it is that we can ask of our nearest by nature. And we'll take this to the next area and look at biodiversity in Toronto and some questions that people have asked, and then some beautiful resources that are available to help us learn from citizen scientists and those who are documenting some of their nature observations around the city. So the Toronto Biodiversity Series, if you haven't discovered it yet, I don't know about you, but I get tired of all the screens. So I love that these are available in the libraries. And if your library branch has reopened, I have seen them there. So they're, it's not to check out, you actually get to own it. They have these beautiful booklets on the biodiversity of Toronto. So mushrooms of Toronto, spiders, I think there's birds, trees. Help me out if anybody remembers the other ones. Thanks so much. Yeah, so we've got lots of different fishes, mammals. Awesome, Emily. We've got lots of different taxa that you can kind of get into. So Margaret Atwood has an intro. There's beautiful photography, some simple identification techniques. But then also, if you are kind of dorky and into the nitty-gritty science, you can take your inquiry a step further and look at perhaps the habitat where the different species of spiders make their home, and then think how we can conserve natural habitat to support a range of wildlife in our nearby spaces. So that's an excellent, oh, and there's also a link online, I should say. So the biodiversity series is all available by PDF. If you want to just click into it, you can find those there. And I love this quote from it, that biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth. It includes all living things and the ways in which they interact with each other. So it goes beyond just sort of a list of species. Like if you're a birder, you might have a bird list, right? What it is that you saw, which species you saw. Biodiversity also includes the interactions, right? So what are those, what species are those birds eating? What caterpillars need to be there when the birds are feeding their young? And that's an interaction where you can look a little bit beyond just a taxonomic list. As Sarah mentioned, I'll just briefly give you some of the cold facts that biodiversity is in decline. We're going to look more today about what we can do to support biodiversity, but it's really important to note that this is a drastic change in recent decades. Climate change, habitat loss, and other threats are reducing the biodiversity on both global and local scales. So this has been documented. And the loss is a direct result of human activity and constitutes a direct threat to human well-being in all regions of the world. So we're not just looking at biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, we're also thinking about the connections to a species of human beings that also relies on that biodiversity. So the more we can protect it, the more we help ourselves as well. See if I can click through here. And I like to think of positive feedback cycles with biodiversity, and another issue that we'll talk about today, invasive species. So this could go two directions, right? A decline in biodiversity has effects, but let's look at it from a positive standpoint, because this has also been shown that if you're promoting biodiversity and increasing biodiversity in natural spaces, this is mitigating the effects of climate change. And we know that mitigating climate change prevents the spread of invasive species. So those harmful species that are not adapted to the local environment and don't have natural predators perhaps, so can take over, the invasive species that are causing problems. If you're combating the invasive species, then you're protecting biodiversity. And then, of course, you have greater biodiversity, and that mitigates climate change, and you can see how it's a positive feedback cycle. The more you do, the more effects you have. So it's kind of a wonderful action that you can take. And just see here. Awesome. Thank you for using the chat resource. I'm just going to take one example of biodiversity in action and look at native pollinators. I think this time of year, it's sort of less of a hot topic item. People think about flowers in the spring, but there's really good reason to think about pollinators in the fall, and I'll explain that. Native plants, we know, support native pollinators. So those species that have co-evolved with a specific pollinator to disperse the plant's genetic material, we know that they are doing really well together. The plants support the pollinators, and the native pollinators can support plant health. In turn, this is the basis for the food webs. So good fruit set, for example, if a pollinated plant is able then to grow more fruit because it was pollinated, then that can support additional wildlife, our friendly black bear, our own food sources. So 1 in 3 bites of human food that came because a pollinator visited the flower created the fruit was harvested and then brought to our markets. That's 1 in 3 bites of all of our food supported by pollinators. Huge for the economy, and we call those ecosystem services, things that are coming out of those ecosystem benefits that can in turn benefit up the chain or further along towards other uses. On the flip side, if we're reducing the biodiversity of our native pollinators and don't have as many native bees visiting all of the flowers, for example, then you can have something called incomplete pollination. So if you've ever seen a funky apple or sort of a squashed up strawberry like this one, this lopsided fruit is due to incomplete pollination in a lot of cases. So the bee wasn't able to visit the flowers many times, for example, and the apple didn't have as many seeds develop. And so part of the apple is actually reduced. Believe it or not, because of the mechanization, this leads to a tremendous amount of food waste. It's really expensive because rounder apples are easier to ship. So it's totally bizarre, but thinking about how the chain pulls together, and at the basis of that, over and over again, we come back to biodiversity. A tremendous critter that is helping with this issue is the blue orchard bee. So almost all the photos from here are taken by volunteers, by citizen scientists. This one was an iNaturalist photo. So submitted to free citizen science platforms online like iNaturalist. It's incredible what people are are able to do with photography. The female blue orchard bee, I just learned, 250 of them is equivalent of 20,000 honeybees in pollination effort. So for an acre of apples, you can think about the difference there because of the way that they pollinate the flowers and their body format and all of the location of the hairs. Like the nitty-gritty of it is totally fascinating that this native bee can support so much pollination, not just for apples, but for our wild plants, the plants in our gardens, and the plants in our parks that are making even more biodiverse ecosystems. So how can we protect amazing critters like these? Obviously, we want to reduce pesticide use because pollinators are very susceptible to insecticides. Even trace amounts can confuse the bees so that they're not able to find their nest, for example. So it might not even be a fatal level that's affecting that ecosystem service of pollination. And then protecting habitat. So we can talk a little bit about what that means, and in the fall, what you can do to protect native habitat for pollinators. I found this amazing resource. So this is a tool, the Habitat Assessment Guide for Pollinators in Yards, Gardens, and Parks, put out by another organization that we've worked with called Xerces Society. And we'll share that link so that you can assess habitat where you live if you're interested in taking assessment to another level. There's two ways. You could walk around and say, which pollinators did I notice? Did I see any flowers here? And just sort of do anecdotal evidence, maybe snap a photo for iNaturalist, like that beautiful bee that we saw. All of that is really good. That's observations that are important collectively for science. But you can take a more measured approach and use a tool like this that will walk you through step by step. Okay, let's look at 2 meters squared, count the flowers, how many of these are native flowers. And there's a resource there that shows you what native plants in your in the Great Lakes area, in this case, would qualify as native plants, right? So this is a good project if you're looking for something a little bit more involved you can do, or maybe with a few neighbors, just to come up with a habitat score for pollinators at your location. And what I love about it is that in addition to the assessment, what's there, it's giving you a score and suggestions for changes that you could create. So for example, if the gardens surrounding a park are able to support more pollinators by doing native plantings, then you get a higher score because you're planting those native plantings. So it's the tool to look at what you have and then imagine what it could be and help you decide, make those small decisions. If we only have $100 budget to improve this area, what would be the greatest impact for pollinators? So it's a PDF, it's about 8 pages available at that link if you want to take a look. And EcoSpark is interested in your use of this tool. So we're going to share our contact information at the end. We're hoping to develop it so that schools can participate and evaluate the habitat at their school grounds. So we would love to know if you're using this tool, if you have any suggestions, and then as we develop it for students, if you're interested in combining your data with the school data. So maybe a park and a school that are neighboring each other could have a combined map. We offer those through the EcoSpark website, so they can look at collective pollinator habitat. There are a few tips here. You can check for long season and late season blooms. Basically by October, if you're looking around and you're seeing flowers, that's pretty good. The bees, if you think about like opening the fridge and it's totally full, the bee can only eat so much of the flower resources on that one day or like early burst of spring blooms. But what's more important is that they have a small grocery bill every week of the entire season, so that when they are foraging and when the nest is looking for resources later in the season, they're also finding flowers. So the more variety, back to biodiversity, of your blooms and your blooming times, the better that is for pollinators. There's resources to help you plan for spring. So again, those native plant lists that will help you if you want to enhance your habitat. And then thinking about the fall too, a lot of people are in tidy up mode, and just a suggestion that as you are taking away any sticks or twigs, raspberry canes, things that kind of look old and dry, if you can bundle them up and then leave them near the site, if there are any solitary bees that are using those resources as their home, they can still complete their life cycle and emerge and pollinate your flowers again next year. So if you're tidying, still leave things on site. Leaves are good too. If there is a place where you can make sort of a small brush pile or keep leaves and odds and ends, those are great pollinator nesting sites. And then engage with your neighbors. So if you've been involved in gardening, or if you want to learn more about gardening, scope out the neighborhood and see who's involved. And it's pretty easy now to strike up a conversation and learn from each other. One of the projects that we've done with EcoSpark is to build nesting houses. So we use reeds, in this case, an invasive plant called Phragmites that we very carefully harvested just the stems from, and then turned them into pollinator homes. So if you were able to participate and you have a pollinator home, like a bee house, fall is a great time to maintain those. I think it's great that people are putting them out, and it's important that we keep them clean so that we're not actually causing more trouble for the pollinators that use them. So it's recommended that you clean it out each year. And in the fall, you can do that. There's some protocols that David Suzuki Foundation has published so that they're local as well, on how to harvest the living cocoons and then clean out the rest of your box. And then actually have those cocoons available to pollinate next year. So if you have questions, we can share some resources about those, but just take a look at what you've got going right now. Remember to be pesticide free at home as well, and plant more flowers. And then even if you're just walking down the sidewalk and you notice some bare loose ground, consider that that might be an amazing spot for pollinators to overwinter. So we know, for example, queen bumblebees will burrow into the loose bare ground so they can emerge with the very first rays of sun in the spring and start their new colony. So if you think about the importance of protecting that one bee that is the time capsule for the entire nest, she needs to get through the entire winter. So you can protect that and not trample any spots of bare ground that you might see. And then, as I mentioned, leave leaves, brush, and raspberry canes to overwinter. So all of these examples are biodiversity in action, and there's some additional great resources. I love this book called Bringing Nature Home, about sustaining wildlife with native plants. So if you're looking for more specific ideas to promote biodiversity, Doug Talamy has said, is not only possible, but highly desirable from a human perspective to create living spaces that are themselves functioning, sustainable ecosystems with high species diversity. So I think it's really important to protect our most wild spaces and kind of the remote, untouched areas. But I think it's also important that we rethink our own living spaces and how we can make them adaptable and well suited to the wildlife that can cohabit with us. For citizen science itself, we're going to look now at a few examples of how you can participate right away. Again, when we're doing nearby nature studies, there's not a strict definition for what counts as citizen science. So you can start with a question just like we did and think, well, what is this neat bug? You can use a short time frame. So a 15-minute survey is a good starting place. How many birds can we find in 15 minutes? And then ask a few questions. Ask your neighbors some questions. Are the birds that you're seeing different from your childhood? What if you ask somebody who's very young that question, somebody who's very more experienced in their neighborhood, and see if you can find differences over time. Identify and report invasive species. So the tool that we'll look at for that is called EDDMapS, and we'll go through, how you would report any invasive species, or even learn if you're not sure if it's invasive or not. It's a tool that can help you find out. And then as we discussed planting at home for biodiversity, there's really wonderful tools with iNaturalist to help you explore that local biodiversity near your house. So my favorite web page right now is the ecospark iNaturalist project. We're asking anybody who's already a member of iNaturalist to click on join for our project, because we are using local citizen science data to help build programs for students. And the more data that we have from local volunteers, the more evidence the students see of their handiwork in action. If they're flagging an invasive plant, for example, then they can see what their neighbors have found as well and watch for changes over time. If you're not a member yet of iNaturalist, we'll talk about that. And the EcoSpark project is a great starting point because there's journal entries that would come out and sort of offer some more insights into our local ecosystems here. So to get started, you would visit iNaturalist.ca. And you can download an app if you'd like to have something on your device. There's two choices. So iNaturalist publishes the iNaturalist app, and that's a direct way to share all of your nature photos with the global naturalist community. Anybody can see them if they visit the iNaturalist website. Or if you are not ready to make a free account yet and you want to just kind of poke around, or maybe you have children who are interested in participating but they don't want to actually submit photos to the website, they can use, it's called Seek. It's an app that just lets you explore nature and isn't recording any of the observations unless you select that you want it to be linked to an iNaturalist account. So iNaturalist is the basic one, and then Seek, if you're interested in just learning, that gives you some more tools to play around with. And we'll look at both of those briefly. The whole idea with gathering some information and observations around you is that we're recording information that anybody can use to learn more about what we're seeing. So the kinds of things that you might photograph and add to an iNaturalist account are wildlife from your community. You can look at any wild plants, including weeds. Weeds are actually more important and more interesting from a scientific standpoint than cultivated plants, because we want to see, for example, how dandelions are responding to the changing climate. Are they blooming earlier? Are they blooming later? The wild species, even those in our midst, are giving us more clues in that way to broader ecosystem patterns. So you can point your phone at an insect, a plant that you might see, or you can take a photo and submit later. Then you would select when you saw it. So it should automatically have the date on the app, but otherwise you can just jot down in your notebook what date you saw it. And the evidence, I should mention, can be a sound. So if you like to listen to bird calls, you could record the bird or the frog calls and submit that. It doesn't have to be a photo. And then the location. So I'll mention here, if you're using the app, it will give you a circle that shows the general location, but there's an option so you can make it a broader circle if you don't want it to be exactly your address. I think right now the default is set that it's about your neighborhood size. And that's important to know, especially if you find a species at risk, you can indicate that it's found generally here so you don't have 1 million people going to visit whatever the snowy owl that you saw, and you can set sort of a general location. And then who you are. So iNaturalist does require an account, and it's just your email and your name. And this is why it's suggested for people over 13. If you're not ready to make an account, you can use Seek instead. So the way that both Seek and iNaturalist provide you with interesting biodiversity information is by comparing what you're looking at with the photos that other volunteers have submitted. So for example, if you point your device using either app, in this case the Seek app, at an orange and black butterfly, and say you don't know the name for that species, then it's cross-checking with all of the other orange and black butterflies, and we'll come up with a suggestion, and hopefully if it's a clear enough image, they'll say, this is a monarch butterfly, do you agree? And you can learn a little bit more about the names. I think this is great for English as a second language learners as well, to learn about more of the local names for wildlife that share our homes. And then Seek is very fun. It gives you a virtual badge for the different types of wildlife that you're seeing. So I found a snail and I got a mollusk badge, which is kind of exciting. It gamifies it a little bit if you're into that. And the other thing that we can do with tools like these citizen science observation tools, is to flag invasive species and some of those problem organisms so that we can figure out the best way to steward our local spaces. So I'm just going to start here with one more definition, bear with me, and we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. I'm going to leave time. So invasive species are defined as non-native species introduced from another geographic region, whose introduction or spread negatively impacts native biodiversity, the economy, and/or society, including human health. Right, so we have two parts to that definition. It's really important to note that an invasive species is not just non-native, it's also causing problems. Invasive species management through Ontario has prohibited and restricted a number of invasive species that pose a risk to the natural environment. So you can learn more about the nitty-gritty of that with the Invasive Species Act, and that's very important to help prevent and control the spread of invasives so that our biodiversity is promoted and thriving. Federal invasive species rules are also enforced, and citizen scientists can help. So the recommendation is that volunteers anywhere, homeowners, people who are walking through natural spaces, parks, anywhere, that they report invasive plant species that they find. So a report would include the location, the date, and preferably if you can track over time to see if it's growing, if it's spreading, the extent of the infestation. So you can see here a garlic mustard infestation around a tree. You would say that this is about 1 meter, and that would be the extent of that garlic mustard patch. And then pinpointing these locations helps map the spread. So for example, we want to know if a new invasive species has come into Ontario, and citizen scientists are our way to learn about that. So we're helping to monitor native species as well. The iNaturalist observations of both natives and invasives are important for management. And it's a really helpful tool to help us learn more and spread the word. So it's a quick way to let somebody know what an invasive species is. For example, hey, here's a really cool app where you can submit your invasives and learn more about them. The tool that we recommend for invasive species in particular is called EDDMapS. EDDMapS Ontario, and there are a number of ways to report an invasive species. So it works very similar to iNaturalist. You go into EDDMapS, click on Report and Observation. You can download an app if you like. You'd submit a photo and some of those details, for example, the size of the infestation. You can also use a invading species hotline if you just want to call it in, and that tool is available as well. What this does is centralize all of the reports that all the citizen scientists across Ontario are flagging so that it's in one centralized mapping location that anybody has access to. This is hugely important for stewardship, prioritizing, management, flagging those new spots. And you can do this anywhere in your community, while visiting parks or other natural areas, and if you have permission on private property. The question comes up, should I use EDDMapS or iNaturalist? And either are fine. So if you use iNaturalist, especially if you don't know what it is that you're seeing, if you're not sure if it's an invasive plant, for example, if you snap a photo with iNaturalist or Seek, it will give you a little heads up, hey, this looks like an invasive species, and you can learn more that maybe that is a problem. If you use EDDMapS, however, you can provide a little bit more detail. So anything that goes into iNaturalist that's an invasive species will also be directed into EDDMapS once it's verified. So naturalists will view any photos that go into iNaturalist that have been flagged as potential invasives, confirm from the photo if that's an invasive, and then add those records to EDDMapS. So it will make its way into there. However, EDDMapS asks just a few more questions that are really important, I think, for invasive species management. It provides more real-time tracking, so it's a little bit faster to note where things are. And then things like, what's the extent of this location? Kind of easy things to answer that are specific to the invasives will get captured in the EDDMapS tool. I also love that it has local and international distribution maps and sort of info cards that are directly related to the plants that you might see. So we're not going to go into too much detail on the invasives that you might see, but a few that are, I would say, kind of homework if you're interested in learning more. Garlic mustard and Phragmites are two that we've seen causing a lot of problems in Toronto. And I know somebody mentioned in the chat also dog strangling vine. So all three of those can be found on the EDDMapS reporting tool, and you can learn more about how to identify them, especially in the fall, now that the growth form is just a little bit different. For example, this garlic mustard photo shows the white flowers in May, but now in fall, it will have long green seed pods that are kind of dried out. The way that you would tell garlic mustard, my favorite ID tip, is to crush the leaves, and if it smells like garlic, it's probably garlic mustard. So in the interest of time, I'm going to show you that there are maps that people have started reporting locations for garlic mustard and other invasives. And our second sort of bad species to keep an eye out for is Phragmites. And this is a tall, it's also called the common reed. It's a tall wetland plant that has huge implications. Where I grew up in Delaware, there's just miles and miles and miles of Phragmites. It's kind of incredible from a biological standpoint what this plant is capable of. But also it's incredible from a volunteer perspective, what we can do as it's coming into Ontario. Here you can see that Phragmites is distributed throughout the province. But volunteers, including the City of Toronto Stewardship Program volunteers, have taken steps to manage Phragmites quite successfully in some of the parks across the city using pesticide-free techniques. There's a report on EcoSpark's website that shows that project and the amazing work by Lynn Short, a professor who developed these techniques. So people really are making a difference, citizen science volunteers, and that includes those who are just flagging, hey, I see some Phragmites in my environment. So take a moment to look at that and learn some of the ID tips. And we're going to wrap up here so that we have a few minutes for questions. Finally, I would just like to say, if you're going to remember just a few things from this presentation, invasive species reporting is key. It maximizes the effectiveness and accessibility of Ontario's 50,000 plus invasive species observations if we can kind of pool them together into either EDDMapS or iNaturalist. So I would encourage you to look into that. And native plants support biodiversity. So really the takeaway is that wherever we're supporting native plants, we're supporting, remember that feedback cycle, and we're mitigating the effects of climate change, which prevents the spread of these harmful invasive plants, and it supports our native pollinators as well. They were established over millions of years and evolved together with indigenous wildlife. So these native plants are well adapted to our local climate and soil conditions. So they're diverse, but they're stable. So it's like strength and diversity here. It's really great. We have a personal challenge for you that if you could try and collect and submit observations. I think a good goal to start with is 5 nature observations this week. And they could be as simple as doing an iNaturalist ecospark contribution for something that's flowering outside of your home right now. You can check out some of the other citizen science tools that are out there. We're going to be talking about some in an upcoming webinar next Friday, including window bird surveys. So eBird has some really great resources to help you connect with birding skills in the same platforms of shared naturalist photos and identification tools. And hopefully, if you're able to attend next Friday, we can share on the chat what observations people have seen over the week. And they'll come up on a website like this so that you can pinpoint on the map where your nature observations are, and then see where your neighbors are taking photos as well. So I know we've had some questions for invasive plants, and the guidance, I think, for reducing the spread of invasive plants is really to share the word, right? So help people understand that if they stay on trails and keep their pets on leash, then they're not spreading those invasive seeds. Encourage your neighbors to submit invasive species reports. And follow best management practices. If you are trying to control a local infestation, there's really great resources that tell you for each invasive species what techniques you can apply to your own land to prevent and control those infestations. So I would check out the Ontario Invasive Plant Council for specific resources. And then we'll share the links for native plants and biodiversity suggestions for your own yards if you're interested in promoting that. The webinar that I mentioned is scheduled for same time, same place. So next Friday at noon, we're going to be talking about the benefits of trees and some of the amazing wildlife that our local urban forest supports. So there's bird surveys and some other critters that make use of trees, as well as climate impacts. I hope you can join us then. Tell your friends. We'll have just a brief intro, but most of the content will be unique for next week. Also stay in touch. We've got lots of programs out there, ecospark.ca. There are in-person programs with PPE in place. So my voice is a little hoarse from talking outdoors through a mask all week with different groups. And we've got training available for adults, teachers, families, youth volunteers, and online programs as well. So check us out, and thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm gonna open up the floor and see if we have any questions. Oh, and Emily, I'm so sorry. Would you like to just dip in here for community stewardship program?
Thanks, Dana. This has been wonderful. Always a treat to have some information on EcoSpark's programs. So I coordinate the community stewardship program with urban forestry. we're part of the Natural Environment and Community Program Unit in Forestry. And so the Community Stewardship Program is a great opportunity to learn more about how to manage invasive species. We have currently 7 sites throughout the city. A lot of them are focused in around the Don River. And so we remove invasive species like garlic mustard, Phragmites. As you saw, Dana's slide indicated that we did a research project together studying effective ways to remove Phragmites. We do planting of native species. And so we had a modified season this year. If you're interested in learning more about how to sign up next season, you can email us at greentoronto@toronto.ca. And we also have some October public planting and stewardship events. So email us about that if you haven't found out about those dates. So before we wrap up, we should get some questions answered here. I know, Dana, that somebody had asked the difference between invasive and introduced species, and we got a similar question from, let's see, similar question. Did you see that one? Exotic species invasive.
Thanks, Emily. That is a good question. Thanks everyone for participating, and we'll hang out just a couple more minutes to answer some of these. Quick question for exotics. The answer is that no, not all non-native species are invasive. They have to also be causing a problem, and a problem could be for environment and economy. It could be even human health issues. So there's those 2 parts for it. Not all plants that aren't from here, for example, are causing problems if you put them in their garden. However, I will say that all of the plants that are causing problems, at some point in the past, people thought maybe this won't be an issue. So we really encourage you to go with natives wherever you can, and that's going to support the most native biodiversity. Do we have any other questions? You can feel free to unmute. I know it was a